December 1970. School segregation and attempted gun theft gone wrong. Around the world, the most talked-about piece of news in December 1970 would have been Paul McCartney filing a lawsuit to dissolve the Beatles. Meanwhile, in Northern Ireland, we had a further death and more political developments. One of the big talking points in December was the publication of a pamphlet on the topic of segregation in education in Northern Ireland by the head of the Catholic Church in Ireland, Cardinal William Conway. The introduction of the pamphlet looked at why the debate on integrated schools existed. The question of segregated schools, as they are called, has been flickering across the screen in Northern Ireland fairly constantly during the past few years. Politicians' speeches, television debates, and the correspondence columns of newspapers have all made their contribution. Very often the message conveyed is quite simple, that segregated schools are one of the basic causes of trouble in Northern Ireland, and that for this the Catholic Church is to blame. So far as I can recall, this message first began to go forth about 5 or 6 years ago. At that time, the voices raised against discrimination in Northern Ireland, in jobs, housing, and the local franchise, were beginning to be heard. It was suggested that while Catholics were being asked to participate in community life, they were largely ignored when it came to local government jobs or even appointments to non-salaried posts on statutory bodies. It was this policy, the argument went, which effectively cut Catholics off from participating in the life of the community. Then someone had an idea. It was the Catholics themselves who were cutting themselves off by their voluntary apartheid in the schools. This was evidently thought to be a good political line. It was simple and clear, and it put the boot on the other foot. As a political tactic, it has had some success, but by now people generally recognize that, at least in the mouths of right-wing politicians, it is somewhat lacking in sincerity, as one of the leaders of the New Ulster movement said early in 1970. Many of those who clamour for integrated education would be the first to object if someone waved a magic wand and produced it. Protestant extremists would obviously resist the prospect of nuns and Christian brothers teaching their children in integrated schools. And a correspondent from the Times Educational Supplement who visited Northern Ireland a year ago summed up his own impressions in a single sentence. At the moment, the only people who are professing wholesale desegregation are extreme unionists who believe that this is as good a stick as any to beat the Catholics with. Similar to some of the other pamphlets, booklets and flyers that were circulated throughout the early stages of the Troubles in Northern Ireland, by groups within both sides of the conflict, I can't help but feel this could have very much been seen as another piece of propaganda, which could have potentially stirred up some more resentment from one side or another. I personally feel that issues such as education should be left to elected representatives to discuss in government, ensuring that there is some consistency in approach. But what do I know? I'm just a guy with a keyboard. There was a meeting by the Official Advisory Committee at Stormont, where they discussed the topic of minority groups in government, and also Cardinal Conway. I found the first few points on the meeting minutes quite interesting. The government needed to decide upon its basic philosophy in relation to the minority. Did it consider itself at war with the minority, or did it believe in treating it fairly, firmly, and openly? At present, the government's attitude was not clear. This was exemplified in the position of minority representation in public bodies. The accusation had been made that Catholics nominated for public bodies were not sufficiently radical, but the Cabinet had only given a very grudging acceptance to a proposal that opposition MPs should be asked to submit a list of names. If the government did desire to improve its relationship with minorities, new initiatives were undoubtedly required. It had to be recognized that in the final analysis, the government did not rule with the consent of all. Accordingly, unless new lines of communication could be built up within a constitutional framework to allow the minority greater participation in government, frustration might lead to more extreme minority leadership and a possible renewal of street activity with inevitable consequences for the future stability of Northern Ireland and the present constitutional arrangements. If a new initiative were to be taken, it would be best directed towards the elected parliamentary representatives of the minority rather than through Cardinal Conway or organizations such as the Central Citizens Defense Committee. It was felt that new initiatives might not make any great headway with the Cardinal at this juncture, while recognition of CCDC would give this body a status, which it did not merit, and would tend to undermine the position of the democratically elected representatives. The 23rd of December 1970 saw another life lost, widely reported to be the work of the Provisional IRA. A Protestant man, a married father of 4, Andrew Jardine, 65, was shot dead at his home in Hannestown, Belfast. The book, Lost Lives, speculated that the incident resulted from an attempted robbery of guns stored in the house. 3 years after the events of the 23rd of December 1970, a press report appeared that described what happened. Christmas Eve was only a few hours away. The night was dry and cold. There wasn't much sign of a white Christmas. In the kitchen of her home, a middle-aged Belfast woman was doing some seasonal baking. Earlier, she had helped her married daughter and her 2 children put up a Christmas tree. Her husband finished with the day's work and was pottering around the house. A knock came on the door. Expecting the carol singers, the daughter quickly made her way to the hallway to welcome them. But the carol singers brought death and heartbreak to the family for whom Christmas would never be the same again. I saw a young man at the front door. I opened it just enough to speak to him. He put his hand inside his coat and immediately started to force his way into the hall. I tried to close the door, and the man produced a revolver from inside his coat. I called to my father, and I then saw 2 other men pull the front door open, and the first man went into the hall. When I tried to close the door, the bottom pane of glass was broken. As I was struggling with the men at the door, I heard a number of gunshots ring out in the hall, and I could smell smoke. Mr. Jardine was a gun collector and was able to fire 4 times before dying. At the end of December, the financial cost of the disturbances and riots during 1969 and 1970 was estimated to be £5.5 million. With inflation, today that would equate to a staggering $33.2 million. Thanks for listening to this episode of Tales of the Troubles. If you enjoyed this episode or any others, please like or comment to help the algorithm reach other like-minded people. To ensure you never miss an episode, please click the follow button and enable notifications. If you have family or friends who would also like this podcast, please share. Stay tuned for our next episode, where we take a closer look at January 1971.